this video, we're going to treat briefly of a very important topic when it comes to describing ourselves and thinking about ourselves: reasoning. The statue on the slide there is Rodin's famous statue of the thinker. There's something narcissistic about this, about a being that sees itself as fundamentally inward, using the light of reason to arrive at truth. Now, this should have a familiar ring to it, because you may remember the important figure of René Descartes, who we met earlier on in this course. And Descartes tried to conjure up a vision of a mind that was entirely private and was entirely separate from everything else in the universe. That was the problem of the cogito. It's not a plausible story, but it has influenced the way we think about ourselves hugely. And Descartes' opinion was that the mind was where reason sat. Reason for him played the role of making a semi-divine being of mankind, clearly separate from all the animals. So he saw that the proper objects of the mind were logic and pure reason. He didn't separate the two. We might want to separate the two. And he saw that the more the mind occupies itself with other stuff, the more likely it is to fall into error. And you can see there's a great fear here of getting it wrong, the problem of error. For Descartes, not necessarily for us, for Descartes, he thought that the mind could reach indubitable truths as long as it managed to disconnect itself from the untrustworthy data provided by the senses. Now, Descartes lived at the start of the 17th century, but this kind of thinking became firmly established at the start of what we now call scientific modernity. So it became part of the image with which Europeans, Westerners, and those who were engaged in the scientific modernity project described themselves. Sometimes not all that seriously, as here Benjamin Franklin saying, "So convenient a thing to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do." If you firmly believe that you are a reasonable creature, you can make no error. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the various kinds of reasoning that have been developed, seeing what they're good for and what they're not good for. And what we'll discover is there's no simple way to characterize reason, and reason is distinct from logic. And we are not semi-divine beings, most probably. We certainly share an awful lot with animals. And to put reason as the hallmark that separates us from the animals is somewhat problematic. Remember, to René Descartes, at his time, his view that animals lacked reason while humans had it made it perfectly acceptable for him to perform vivisection on a live dog. So a worldview that allows you to treat animals as if they were unconscious, insentient beings is problematic. But these thoughts lie deep in our foundations. Where reason was once seen as distinctly human and therefore foreign to the animals, we find, the more we look, more and more evidence of what we somewhat loosely call reason is widespread. This is part and parcel of a development of late in which humans look around themselves and find many of the things that they thought were distinctively human occur in a variety of forms in the animal world, emphasizing our continuity with animals. So you can see here an example from some famous experiments by Klaus Kohler of chimpanzees solving problems, assembling tools. In this case, the chimpanzee is assembling two pieces of pole in order to make a tool which will allow the chimpanzee to reach up and grab a banana. And it's not always to the chimpanzees that we need to turn. As usual, as we decenter man in our vision of nature, we find commonalities with creatures we wouldn't necessarily expect it. Notice how we have only in the last few decades come to realize that, hang on, octopuses are incredibly clever. And octopuses are about as far removed from humanity as you can get. So here's a little video of a famous crow called Betty. And you can see her here making and using a tool. Yay, good for Betty. Now, I don't know what social media you use. I use Twitter, and my Twitter timeline is absolutely full of animals doing the craziest stuff. And many of them are just kind of cute, and many of them kind of make you think. But in each case, what you have is a small video clip that really doesn't tell you much about the context, the history of the animal, and doesn't allow you to make a cautious, critical judgment as to whether your interpretation of these animal antics is sound or not. That doesn't mean that it's not possible to investigate such things. In this case, Betty has been studied intensively, and what you saw was not a one-time thing. It's a performance that she has repeated many times. We can expect more surprises here in the future. Now, the way that people have thought about reason is as an intellectual activity that sort of takes what you know and generates new stuff from it. So it doesn't help you to identify a goal or to identify a problem. Reason, as it's been classically considered, allows you to develop new statements of fact from old statements of fact. And reason and logic were inseparable, really, until about the 19th century. And that comes from Aristotle, the famous old Greek, who introduced this example of a kind of formal reasoning, and we'll come to this later. It's called syllogistic reasoning. And a syllogism has two premises. And premises are things that we're just going to assume for now. All men are mortal, just assume that, and Socrates is a man. So if you know both of those things and they're both correct, then it is safe to conclude, correct to conclude, that Socrates is mortal. That may not seem like a big achievement here. It is rather simple. But I'd ask you to consider that this is probably the first statement of an algorithm in human history. That is, the first statement of how to derive statements unambiguously from prior statements, by rule, as it were. So reason doesn't deliver truth to uncertainty. If your premises are nonsense, then you can reason with them all you like, and you won't get anywhere. Now, Aristotle did not distinguish between logic and reasoning. Logic has become much more involved in the domain of mathematics of late, and is somewhat separate from reasoning, which it turns out that what we meant by reasoning is not only this kind of thing. That's a very limited form of reasoning. But we engage in several kinds of reasoning, and we're going to look at three: inductive reasoning, abductive reasoning, and deductive reasoning. And these are our attempt to make sense of the domain of reasoning. And what we find is inductive reasoning is well-defined, deductive reasoning is well-defined, and abductive reasoning is very poorly defined. And what we find is inductive reasoning doesn't correspond to what we really do, and deductive reasoning probably doesn't correspond to what we really do, and abductive reasoning with all its messiness is probably a better description of what we really do. So let's be clear about what we mean here. Inductive reasoning. This is reasoning on the basis of past experience to make predictions about the future. So if you come out of your cave every morning and you see the sunrise in the east, and this has been going on, and you heard from your father, it happened in his time, and your grandfather or your grandmother, you will probably predict that the sun's going to rise in the east tomorrow. I mean, basically anything could happen tomorrow, right? But you, on the basis of past experience, you feel confident in predicting that the sun will rise in the east tomorrow. Notice that that's not a dead certain conclusion. I mean, we would row in with it. It seems like a really good bet, but it's not logically compelling. Take, for example, the situation of this turkey, who's an inductive reasoner, and this turkey reasons, I have been fed every single day. The farmer comes and gives me food. Right up to today, it's the 23rd of December. I bet you I'm going to get food tomorrow. There's something the turkey doesn't know, and that's Christmas. So you can see that this kind of reasoning is doesn't provide absolute certainty. Descartes wouldn't like it, in other words. The conclusion that you draw in inductive reasoning is probably the case based on past experience. So the past experience is playing the role of premises here. And even if they are 100% correct and accurate, the future remains somewhat unpredictable. So that's a kind of reasoning called inductive reasoning. The kind that's least well defined is abductive reasoning. We owe this term to Charles Sanders Peirce, an American philosopher who never made it entirely clear what he meant, but basically, this is the messy business of taking a whole lot of observation and past knowledge and trying to decide what's the best or most likely explanation. So this doesn't traffic in certainty, it traffics in probabilities. It's a bit broad, and notice how this kind of treatment of reasoning allows you to make use of different kinds of argumentation. You're not only depending on past observation, and you're not mechanically reasoning as we saw with the syllogism. And so it's messy. It's not as simple to characterize as inductive reasoning, which was just quite simple to characterize, and deductive reasoning will be quite simple to characterize. But I think by the end of this section on reasoning, we'll probably agree that abductive reasoning, for all its messiness, might be a better description of what we do, and therefore reasoning is not a simple matter or a simple, well-ordered domain. But what about the other kind, deductive reasoning? Deductive reasoning, we just saw illustrated with the syllogism from Aristotle. If you have a set of premises and you have ways of deriving conclusions from those that necessarily follow from those premises, then you are reasoning deductively. In everyday terms, people also call this the use of hard logic. That's not a technical term, but it's useful enough. And the great drawback of deductive reasoning is that it depends absolutely on the truth of your premises. This will preserve the truth of your premises, but it won't add to it. You can find out nothing new about the world in this way. So we will, in subsequent videos, look a little bit more in depth at inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, and there will be a couple of exercises that we'll do in class, which draw on this material. But I'd like to end this video with a kind of a question for you. Scientific inquiry comes in many forms, but it's important to note that science, the business of science, is not the same as the business of mathematics. In fact, if you look at a wide variety of universities, sometimes mathematics is in the science college or faculty, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's in arts. Because mathematics is not clearly about anything other than mathematics, whereas science aspires to being about the world, whatever that is. So ask yourself, which kind of reasoning would you think is more at home here in scientific inquiry and in mathematics? And we'll pick up that question in the next video.